It's 1922, Newark, New Jersey. A young woman is getting ready for a night out. She's 19 years old. Her name is Grace, and tonight she wants to look special. So she does something a little playful. She paints her teeth with the stuff from work. She paints her fingernails, her face, even her dress. And when the lights go out, she glows. Bright, beautiful, ethereal green. Her friends laugh. Her date is amazed. She feels like magic. What she doesn't know, what none of them know, is that the substance coating her skin, her nails, her lips, her teeth, is slowly killing her. And the men who gave it to her, they knew. They always knew. Welcome back. Today we are going deep into one of the darkest, most deliberately hidden stories in American history. A story about young women who were told they were painting the future and were instead handed a death sentence. This is the story of the Radium Girls. And by the end of this video, you're going to be angry, you're going to be heartbroken, and you're going to remember their names. To understand what happened to these women, you need to understand what the world thought radium was in the early 1900s. Short answer? They thought it was a miracle. Marie Curie had discovered radium in 1898, and when scientists realized it glowed in the dark, this beautiful, ghostly greenish light, the world went absolutely wild for it. This was an era before we truly understood radiation, before Geiger counters became standard, before anyone had mapped out what invisible energy could do to a human body from the inside out. What people saw was a mysterious element that glowed, that gave off heat, that seemed to have endless energy. So naturally, the early 20th century decided, let's put it in everything. And I mean everything. Radium water, radium chocolate, radium face cream, radium toothpaste, advertised as making your teeth whiter and your smile more vibrant. There was even a radium-infused contraceptive jelly. One company sold a ceramic crock called the Revigator. You filled it with water. The radium in the walls would energize the water overnight. The instructions said to drink 6 or more glasses a day. People genuinely believed radium made you healthier, more vigorous, more alive. So when the United States Radium Corporation opened a factory in Orange, New Jersey in 1917 and started hiring young women to paint watch dials with radium paint, it wasn't seen as a dangerous job. It was seen as a good job. The pay was excellent, far more than most women could make in a factory at that time. The work was considered skilled. It required a steady hand and a sharp eye. The girls who were hired were proud. They called themselves dial painters. And the glowing paint they used, the company had a name for it. They called it Undark. Should have been a red flag, maybe. But back then, it just sounded magical. The dial painting studio was actually a nice place to work by the standards of the time. It was light and airy. The girls sat at long tables, bent over tiny watch faces, painting the numbers and hands with fine-pointed brushes. There was laughter, gossip, friendships formed. There were hundreds of them, mostly young women, some as young as 14 or 15. Many were recent immigrants or daughters of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish families, working-class girls who saw this job as a genuine opportunity. The paint itself was a mixture of radium, zinc sulfide, water, and glue. And it had one small technical problem. The brushes kept losing their fine point. So the supervisors, following official company technique, taught the girls to do something called lip pointing. You put the brush between your lips. You use your tongue and lips to reshape the bristles into a sharp tip. Then you dip it in the paint. Then you paint the dial. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. Over and over. All day. Every day. Each time they did this, they ingested a small amount of radium paint. Now here's the crucial thing. The people at the top, the executives, the scientists employed by the company, they knew about the dangers of radium by this point. The evidence was starting to build. Radium's energy didn't just pass through matter. It damaged it. It broke apart cells. It interfered with the body's ability to repair itself. Workers at other radium facilities were getting sick. And the United States Radium Corporation's own scientists, they wore lead aprons. They used lead-tipped tools. They handled radium with forceps, never with bare hands. But the dial painters? They were told the paint was harmless. They were told it was good for them, even. One supervisor reportedly told the girls that swallowing a little radium would put roses in their cheeks. So the girls laughed and joked about their glowing fingers. They painted their nails with the stuff after hours. Some painted their faces to surprise their boyfriends. They took the magic home with them, without even knowing it. And inside their bones, because radium behaves a lot like calcium in the human body, it was quietly, methodically making itself at home. The body, confused by the similarity, absorbed radium just like it absorbed calcium, stored it in teeth, in bones, in bone marrow. And there it began to fire off radiation. Not once, not occasionally, constantly, for the rest of their lives. By the early 1920s, the girls started getting sick. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, the way the worst things always do. The first sign for many of them was their teeth. Toothaches that wouldn't quit, abscesses that formed for no clear reason. Dentists who were baffled because these were young, otherwise healthy women. Their teeth shouldn't be rotting out of their heads. But they were. And then, when the dentists pulled those teeth, what happened next was almost incomprehensible. The jaw didn't heal. Instead, it crumbled. The bone, saturated with radium, had become fragile and rotten. It would develop holes, abscesses, strange growths. In some cases, doctors could press on a woman's cheek and feel the bone literally move beneath the skin, because it had broken apart on the inside. One doctor described it this way. He could remove entire sections of jaw with his bare hands. No tools needed. The bone just came away. Meet Molly Maggia. She was one of the first to fall seriously ill. She'd been a dial painter at the factory, a good one. She started complaining about a toothache in 1921. Within months, the infections had spread through her jaw, then through the bones of her face, then through her skull. The pain was extraordinary. Doctors had never seen anything like it. By the time she died, in September 1922, at just 24 years old, her jawbone had been almost entirely removed in an attempt to stop the decay. It hadn't worked. Her official cause of death? Syphilis. Let that sink in. Molly Maggia, a young working-class woman dying of a mysterious, horrifying disease, was labelled as having syphilis, a disease that carried a devastating social stigma, a disease that implied moral failing. It was a lie, and it wasn't an accident. The company doctor who signed that death certificate, Dr. Edwin Lehman, worked for the United States Radium Corporation. He wasn't an independent physician. He was their guy. And as more women started getting sick, as the pattern became undeniable, the company responded not with concern, but with strategy. Deny, delay, discredit. They hired outside doctors to evaluate the workers and declare them healthy, even when they clearly were not. They suggested the women's illnesses were caused by other factors, lifestyle choices, prior diseases, bad luck. Meanwhile, the women kept dying. Hazel Vincent, Ella Eckert, Irene Rudolph, Albina Larice, Helen Quinlan. Name after name after name. These weren't abstractions. They were daughters, sisters, friends, women who had simply gone to work at a well-paying job and done what they were told. And by the mid-1920s, the doctors who were genuinely trying to figure out what was happening, researchers at Columbia University, for instance, were beginning to piece it together. The cause wasn't a mystery anymore. It was radium. But the company had known far longer than that. Documents would later reveal that by 1924, internal reports were confirming what the scientists already suspected. They'd done studies. They had data. They chose to suppress it. By the late 1920s, some of the surviving women decided they weren't going to go quietly. And that decision, made by women who were already dying, who could barely lift their arms, whose bodies were literally disintegrating, that decision changed American history. The first major legal battle came from a group of 5 women in New Jersey. They became known in the press as the Radium Girls. Their names were Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. They sued the United States Radium Corporation in 1927, and it was hard. Not because they lacked evidence. The medical evidence was overwhelming at this point. Independent researchers had confirmed radium poisoning beyond any reasonable doubt. It was hard because the system wasn't built for them. Their case faced a statute of limitations problem. New Jersey law said you had to file a personal injury lawsuit within 2 years of the injury. But radium poisoning doesn't show up in 2 years. It takes a decade to manifest. By the time these women knew they were sick, the legal window had technically closed. The company's lawyers used this aggressively. And the company itself was no small outfit. They had money, they had lawyers, they had connections. They stalled, they filed motions, they delayed hearings. Meanwhile, the women's condition worsened. Grace Fryer had a back brace just to sit upright. Catherine Schaub could barely speak. These women were attending court dates while dying. The press started paying attention, and suddenly public opinion shifted. because there is something uniquely powerful about watching 5 young, dying women sit in a courtroom and demand justice from the company that killed them. The judge, sympathetic to their condition, agreed to expedite the hearings. He let them testify quickly while they still could. The case never went to full trial. In June 1928, the United States Radium Corporation settled. Each woman received $10,000, the equivalent of roughly $170,000 today. They also received $600 per year for medical bills for as long as they lived, which, for most of them, wasn't going to be very long. It wasn't a massive victory in dollar terms, but what it represented, that was enormous. For the first time, a corporation had been held legally accountable for knowingly exposing workers to a dangerous substance. For the first time, the idea that employers had a duty to protect their employees, not just from obvious accidents, but from invisible, long-term harms, was tested in court and upheld. And then there was Catherine Donahue. She worked at a different factory, the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois. Her story ran a few years behind New Jersey's because the illness took time to manifest. But by the mid-1930s, she was dying too. And she fought too. Even when she was so sick, she had to be carried into the courtroom on a stretcher. Even when the company argued with straight faces that she was making it all up, that she was a liar seeking money she didn't deserve. She won. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor in 1938. The ruling was upheld by the Illinois Supreme Court. Catherine Donahue died a few months later. She was 34 years old. But she had won. She had made them admit it. And somewhere in the paper trail of that case, in the court documents and depositions and scientific reports, was the foundation of something entirely new. The idea that workers had rights. That companies couldn't just use people up and throw them away. That "I didn't know" was not an acceptable defense when you clearly did know. Here's the thing about history that's easy to miss when you're just reading names and dates. Every protection you have at work right now, someone died to get it. Every workplace safety regulation, every requirement that companies disclose known hazards, every law that says an employer cannot lie to you about what you're being exposed to, someone, some group of people, usually people without power, usually people who had nothing to gain for themselves because they were already dying, fought for that. The Radium Girls are a direct line to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, created in 1970. To the modern field of occupational medicine. To the legal principle that companies can be held liable not just for accidents, but for decisions. Deliberate decisions. The kind where someone sits in a boardroom, looks at a report that says our workers are being poisoned, and decides, we'll suppress that. We'll fight the lawsuits. We'll call them liars. We'll outlast them. Because they knew these women were poor. They knew they were young. They knew they didn't have lawyers on retainer. They knew the system wasn't built for them. What they didn't know, what they couldn't account for, was sheer, burning stubbornness. The willingness of dying women to spend their last energy in a courtroom, to put their names in newspapers, to be described in agonizing physical detail by medical experts, stripped of every dignity, all in service of making sure that some company somewhere had to admit what they did. The Radium Girls also left a scientific legacy, literally, because radium decays slowly. Its half-life is 1,600 years. The bodies of the dial painters are still radioactive today. Researchers have studied these women's remains to understand radiation's effects on human bone. Their sacrifice, involuntary, unknowing, horrific, actually contributed to the development of radiation safety standards that protect nuclear workers to this day. They didn't know they were giving that gift. They didn't consent to it. But somehow, even in death, they kept being useful. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, good, it should. Because that's the complicated, ugly, true nature of this story. These women were used by their company. Their deaths were used by science. And the only thing they chose, consciously, deliberately, was to fight back. That part was theirs.
There's one more thing I want to tell you. In 2011, a young woman named Kate Moore was doing research for what would become her book, The Radium Girls. She visited the towns where these women had lived and worked. In Ottawa, Illinois, where Catherine Donahue and her co-workers had laboured, she discovered something strange. The contamination was still there. Houses built near the old factory sites, children's playgrounds, community spaces, all showing elevated radiation readings nearly a century after the factory closed. The Radium Dial Company had been gone for decades, but what they'd done was still in the ground, still in the walls. Some things don't clean up easy. Some things don't go away when the company closes, or the executives retire, or the lawyers move on to other cases. Some damage is permanent. And some stories need to be told again and again, not because they're comfortable, but because they're true. Because the people in them deserve to be remembered. Because when you know what happened to Grace Fryer and Molly Maggia and Catherine Donahue and hundreds of women whose names we don't even know, you understand something real about power, about who gets protected and who gets sacrificed, about what it costs to fight, even when fighting is the only thing you have left. The Radium Girls glowed in the dark. They glowed in courtrooms too. And they should glow in our memory. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it, talk about it, leave a comment below telling me which part surprised you most. I read every single one. And if you're new here, this is what we do. We dig into the stories that got buried, the histories that got sanitized, the people who got erased. So subscribe, because there are so many more stories to tell. I'll see you in the next one.